Hello to all the respected viewers and thank you for joining in. Today I'll be presenting on neurogenic bladder. As this is a vast topic, I have limited myself to presenting only on pediatric urology. And in pediatric urology, neurogenic bladder, I'll cover the pathogenesis, diagnosis, conservative treatment and operative treatment. These are the short forms which I'll be using in my presentation. Starting with the pathogenesis. So before 1960s, only 1 in 10 child survived infancy. Lapidus in 1971 discovered clean intermittent self-catheterization. Because of this discovery, now almost more than 80% of the children survive infancy. As they grow, there is one-third mortality by the end of 5 years and a further one-fourth mortality by end of 40 years. The risk for death correlates with a higher level of neurological deficit. As these patients live longer, renal failure becomes an important cause of mortality, and thus lifelong monitoring and management of the urinary tract is necessary from infancy onwards. 1/8 of the neonates may not have any symptoms at birth, but as they grow, 40%, 60% to 80% will develop symptoms by the end of first year, and less than 1/20 will be continent. Causes can be divided into specific and non-specific. The specific causes are neural tube defects, sacral agenesis, neoplasms, trauma or infection of the central nervous system, or cloacal malformation. Non-specific causes are cerebral palsy, Hinman syndrome, Joshua syndrome. Now, out of all these, neural tube defects is the most common cause of neurogenic bladder in pediatric age group, and that is what we'll be discussing today. Hinman syndrome, it is a form of non-neurogenic bladder. It has characteristic voiding dysfunction of the bladder, and there is no neurological deficit. The patient have got increased urethral pressure, which is functional. Joshua syndrome is a rare condition that causes unusual facial expression and problems with urination. These causes can also be divided into congenital or acquired. So neural tube defects, cerebral palsy, sacral agenesis, all the syndromes, cloacal malformation will be congenital causes, while neoplasm, trauma, infections will be acquired causes. This is how a classical myelomeningocele looks like. The myelomeningocele sac is protruding through the skin layers over the back. The incidence of neural tube defects is around 0.3 to 4.5 per thousand live births, and the most common cause is folic acid deficiency among the mothers. This can be initially easily treated with giving folic acid supplementation. The optimal time for folic acid supplementation is at least 4 weeks before expected conception, and to continue the folic acid for the first month of pregnancy. However, only 1/3 of women take the folic acid supplementation as recommended. Therefore, in early 1990s, the US government regulated fortification of flour and pasta with folic acid, and because of that, now there is a 50 to 70% decrease in neural tube defects. Other causes of neural tube defects are advanced maternal age, maternal obesity, maternal diabetes, flu or fever during the pregnancy, caffeine consumption, poor or low socioeconomic status, maternal smoking, either active or passive, and if she is taking any anti-folic acid drugs like carbamazepine or other anti-convulsant drugs. Almost all patients with neural tube defects suffer from Arnold-Chiari malformation. Arnold-Chiari malformation is a syndrome which consists of hindbrain herniation, brainstem anomalies, low-lying venous sinus, and a small posterior fossa. Earlier, it was treated or it was managed by putting a ventriculoperitoneal shunt. But now it can be effectively treated with endoscopic third ventriculostomy combined with the choroid plexus catheterization. So it effectively manages hydrocephalus in more than 70% of the patients with myelomeningocele, and it also avoids the need for placement of a ventriculoperitoneal shunt. The neural lesion depends on the extent of neural elements everted. So in this sac, the number of nerve fibers which have got entangled and fibrosed will give rise to the neurological signs. The bony vertebral lesion or the bony vertebra corresponding to this lesion provides very little or no clue to the exact neurological level, because sometimes the lesion might be higher in the thoracic level, but the sac does not consist of any neural elements. While this sac might be at the sacral level, but it might involve a lot of nerve fibers. So the bony lesion often does not correspond to the neurological lesion. So the pathogenesis of neurogenic bladder is due to two insults. First is the failure of neural tube formation itself. Secondly, the neural tube may form, but there is continuous nerve damage which is occurring in utero during development of the fetus. So in the uterus, in the amniotic fluid, there are a lot of chemicals which can irritate the meningocele sac, which will lead to fibrosis and in turn the neurological lesions which develop the neurogenic bladder. So it is suggested that in utero intervention may improve outcomes for children with spina bifida. Prenatal closure of spina bifida has been attempted with the help of fetoscopes, and it appears to improve the neuromotor function and decrease the need for VP shunt as the child grows after delivery. However, regarding the bowel and bladder function, the prenatal closure does not help, and in some cases may worsen the bladder and bowel function after delivery. So for neurological lesions leading to bladder and bowel dysfunction, the prenatal surgery is not recommended. Coming to history and examination, history will consist of asking the mother about the urinary stream, the frequency of urination, history of urinary tract infections, incontinence, bowel function, and developmental milestones. And examination should include external genitalia, bag, reflexes, and a voiding diary has to be kept by the mother. Patients may present with a variety of patterns which might include urinary incontinence, stool incontinence, recurrent UTI, vesicuretary reflux, renal scarring, and end-stage renal failure. Starting with the pathogenesis. Investigation and diagnosis starts immediately after birth. The first thing a child undergoes immediately after birth is the closure of myelomeningocele. Once the patient is recovering from this surgery, then his serum creatinine, urine routine, urine culture tests are performed, and a repeat or a follow-up ultrasound of abdomen is done and his post-void residual urine is assessed. The normal bladder capacity in the newborn period is around 10 to 15 ml. So any residual urine which is less than 5 ml is acceptable. The follow-up laboratory tests which are done after 3 months are urodynamics, voiding cystourethropy, and a renal scan or a DMSA. So the objective of these scans are fourfold. First is it will give a baseline information about the radiological appearance of the upper as well as the lower urinary tract. Secondly, it will provide information that can be compared with findings on subsequent assessment so that early deterioration of urinary tract function can be assessed, and if interventions are required, they can be done in a timely fashion. Thirdly, they help identify infants at risk for urinary tract deterioration as a result of poorly compliant or overactive detrusor or outflow obstruction resulting from detrusor sphincter dyssynergia, and it requires the need to initiate prophylactic measures as soon as possible. Fourthly, it helps to counsel the parents about the child's future bladder and sexual function. Now, classification of neurogenic bladder is based upon urodynamic testing. So it is usually done after 3 months. In type 1, which is the most dangerous, there is sphincter overactivity as well as detrusor overactivity. Type 2, there is sphincter overactivity while there is detrusor underactivity. In type 3, there is sphincter underactivity, detrusor overactivity, and in type 4, there is underactivity of both sphincter as well as detrusor. So the first and second are called as dyssynergistic. In the first type, there is dyssynergia along with detrusor overactivity. In the second type, there is dyssynergia without detrusor overactivity. So these account for almost 28 to 29% of the cases. The third type is called as synergistic and it accounts for 26% of the cases, while the fourth type is called as complete denervation and it accounts for 36% of the cases. Findings on these investigations: almost 5 to 10% have abnormal urinary tract at birth. 3% of them might have hydroureteronephrosis. 63% have bladder contractions. Among them, 50% have overcontraction or overactivity. Further, as the child grows, 71% with detrusor sphincter dyssynergia will develop changes at the end of 3 years, and 17% with synergistic and 22% with complete denervation will develop changes. Now, among the 17% of patients with synergia who develop changes, it has been seen that the synergia gets converted into dyssynergia, while in the 22% with complete denervation, it has been seen that there is fibrosis of the external sphincter, which leads to increased outflow resistance. So in all the cases, the bladder outlet obstruction plays a major role in the development of urinary tract deterioration, especially if the resistance exceeds 40 centimeter of water. CDC has developed a protocol and has classified the bladder into 4 types. First is a hostile bladder, in which the detrusor leak point pressure is more than 40 centimeter of water with neurogenic detrusor overactivity with detrusor sphincter dyssynergia. The second type is the intermediate type, in which the detrusor leak point pressure is between 25 to 39 centimeters with detrusor overactivity and there is reduced compliance. In the third type, it is abnormal bladder but safe, in which the detrusor leak point pressures are less than 25 centimeter of water. And in the fourth pattern, it is a normal bladder, in which there is normal capacity, normal compliance, minimal post-void residue, no detrusor overactivity, and no dyssynergia. So the testing which is to be done in infancy starts during the time of discharge. So at the time of discharge, after the myelomeningocele repair has been done, the renal function tests are carried out, and then the patient is put on a bladder catheter during the operation itself. And once healing occurs, the bladder catheter is removed, and then the parents are taught CIC. The bowel function is also optimized at the time of discharge. Between 6 to 12 weeks or at the end of 3 months, there is history taking again. Repeat the labs. A repeat ultrasound of the abdomen has to be done. Bowel functions, if not optimized, have to be optimized again. Then a video urodynamic has to be done. If video urodynamic is not available, avoiding cystourethropy with cystomanometry and electrography has to be done. If a detrusor overactivity is diagnosed, then the patient has to be started on anticholinergics. And if there is diagnosis of vesico-ureteric reflux or detrusor overactivity, then continuous antibiotic prophylaxis has to be started. By the end of 6 months, again we have to repeat the day 1 labs, ultrasound, and bowel function has to be optimized. A repeat cystomyometry has to be done if previously there was a hostile bladder, and a baseline DMSA scan has to be done to see for any renal scarring. At the end of 10 months, again repeat the labs, and at the end of 1 year, repeat the labs, repeat the ultrasound and bowel function optimization. If there is reflux or urinary tract infection, then you have to repeat a video urodynamic. If there is no reflux, only a cystomyometry is sufficient. If there is no reflux, antibiotics can be stopped, and parents are advised to do routine serial urine routine monitoring at home. Management from 18 months to 4 years. At each follow-up, a history and physical examination should be done. Routine day 1 labs along with an ultrasound of the abdomen should be done. Bowel function should be optimized, and the dose of the anticholinergic should be increased as per the weight of the baby. Now from that, yearly after 2 years, that is second year, third year, fourth year, a video urodynamic should be done if there was history of reflux and urinary tract infection. If there was no significant history, a simple cystometry is sufficient. Also, if reflux is not found, you can stop the continuous antibiotic prophylaxis and ask the parents to monitor urine routine samples at home itself. From 5 years till the child attains adulthood, at each follow-up, a detailed history and physical examination should be carried out. Day 1 labs and ultrasound abdomen should be done. Bowel function should be optimized. The dose of anticholinergic should be escalated to match that of body weight. In this particular age group, creatinine for measuring GFR is not a good marker because it is dependent on numerous factors like age, gender, height and muscle mass. The gold standard of measuring GFR is renal scan, but has radiation exposure and cannot be done repeatedly in child as it can be harmful. So another molecule is cystatin C, which can accurately measure GFR and can be used instead of serum creatinine. Starting from adolescence and adulthood, the special discussion should be done regarding sexual function and fertility also. A CMG is done biannually and DMSA is done at 10 years and at 15 years. If this child have received bowel augmentation in the past, special tests have to be done like measuring acid-base balance and serum vitamin B12, and these have to be corrected if found abnormal. Starting with the pathogenesis. The management goals can be divided into primary goals and secondary goals. The primary and the most important goal is preservation or improvement of renal function, while the secondary goals are prevention of recurrent urinary tract infection, improvement of urinary or fecal continence, and to facilitate sexual function and fertility. Early intervention consists of CIC, anticholinergics if there is detrusor overactivity, management of constipation and fecal incontinence, and continuous antibiotic prophylaxis. Regular bowel emptying should be the goal in children, and initially constipation is managed with mild laxatives and enemas. Continuous antibiotic prophylaxis creates bacterial resistance, and it has been found not to be protective against the development of symptomatic urinary tract infections and new renal scarring. So this continuous antibiotic prophylaxis is indicated only in patients with recurrent febrile urinary tract infections and if a vesico-ureteric reflux is present. Otherwise, it should not be given. Cranberry capsules significantly reduce the UTI rate as well as rate of bacteriuria, and these can be given. So a newborn with neurogenic bladder, each bladder is considered to be a potential high pressure bladder and should be treated accordingly. Early management can reduce renal complications in the later life, and also it can delay the need for augmentation. While doing CIC, incidence of UTI is neither affected by the use of sterile or clean technique, coated or uncoated catheters, single sterile use or multiple use of clean catheters, or self-catheterization or catheterization by others, or by any other strategy. Early intervention with anticholinergics, it is indicated in those patients who have detrusor overactivity. So detrusor overactivity causes a high pressure bladder which is dangerous to the upper urinary tract. So for that, anticholinergics are prescribed. The most commonly prescribed drug is oxybutynin in the children. Studies have shown 93% efficacy, and the dosage is around 0.1 to 0.4 milligram per kg per day divided into 3 doses. Now it has got complications like mouth dryness, facial flushing, blurred vision, and heat intolerance. Because of this, many patients stop the treatment even if it is efficacious. Also, long-term treatment with anticholinergics, there is the development of tolerance. So after a particular period of time, these anticholinergics will stop acting. So another way of reducing this complication is by giving the oxybutynin intravesically. So it will reduce the first pass metabolism of the drug which occurs in the liver. So it will reduce the complication, and it is also equally efficacious. Efficacy of oxybutynin has been proven by subsequent urodynamic studies. In the first image, you can see there are uninhibited contractions, and also the peak is around 90 centimeter of water. While on oxybutynin, you can see there is significant reduction in the peak. Also, the peak occurs at a later stage as compared to the initial event. Use of antimuscarinics in children with detrusor overactivity results in increased bladder capacity, increased bladder volume to first detrusor contraction, decreased number of incontinence episodes, and the number of catheterizations. The other anticholinergics which are prescribed are tolterodine, solifenacin, trospium, propionate. Other class of drugs are beta-3 agonists, which is mirabegron. The alpha blockers are also given in patients who have high bladder flow or bladder neck pressures. So how does the early intervention fare? So the urinary tract infection rates without early intervention are 50% by 15 months and 81% by 15 years. So with early intervention, the UTI infections are reduced to only 0.3 per year. The hydroureteronephrosis development rate is 18 to 80%, and with early intervention, the rate is reduced to 0 to 15%. VUR rate from 92% is reduced to 62%, and there is a 18 to 24% reduction in the need for augmentation surgery on early intervention. Renal scarring is reduced to 4 to 12% as compared to 27 to 50% without the early intervention. Constipation can be managed with diet, laxatives, enema, and manual evacuation. If this fails, retrograde transanal irrigation can be performed. Sometimes retrograde transanal irrigation is difficult or impossible due to anatomic or social circumstances. In this scenario, an operative intervention like a Malone antegrade continence enema, Mace appendicectomy can be performed. However, this is the last step in managing constipation as it has got stomal complications like infection, leakage, stenosis, which can occur in as high as 63%, and 33% might require additional surgical revision, and 6% will eventually require a diverting stoma. Now, as the lifespan of these children with neurogenic bladder has increased, so sexuality and fertility have become important issues which have to be discussed with the patients. These patients usually have normal sexual desire. However, the sexual arousal, orgasmic function, overall satisfaction depends on variety of factors. And most patients have a mixed pattern which does not correlate strictly with the level of spinal neurological lesion. So sexual education has to be provided to all the patients, and the degree of sexuality is inversely proportional to the level of neurological dysfunction. Higher the uh, neurological dysfunction, more severe is the problem with fertility and sexuality. And an important point to note is both women as well as men with spina bifida, if they conceive, they have an increased risk of having a child with suffering from spina bifida. In these patients, in the males, erectile function can be improved with use of sildenafil in 80% of the patients. And regarding fertility, 15 to 20% of the males are capable of fathering children, while 70% of the females can conceive. Starting with the pathogenesis. Coming on to operative management starts with botulinum toxin injection, followed by bladder augmentation, followed by continent or incontinent urinary diversion. Then there are interventions to increase the bladder outlet resistance. There are interventions for vesico-ureteric reflux. Then there is neuromodulation and fecal constipation management. Botulinum toxin has shown to improve the continence in 32 to 100% of the patients. It reduces the detrusor pressure in 32 to 54%. The systomatic capacity is increased in 27 to 162%, while bladder compliance improves in 28 to 176%. The side effects of intravesical botulinum toxin include urinary retention, urinary tract infection, hematuria, transient muscle weakness, dysuria, pain. However, in 90% of the patients, the botulinum toxin avoids further bladder augmentation procedures. So it is highly efficacious in those patients who have failed medical management. Another point is botulinum toxin injections can be repeated. and studies have shown that with each repeat injection, the interval between two injections increases after each injection. Serial injections have shown to be show additional significant improvement in the urodynamic parameters, and what was earlier believed regarding tachyphylaxis, now it is proven that tachyphylaxis, neutralizing antibody formation, or progressive fibrosis are not considerations for repeat botulinum toxin injection. Bladder augmentation in children can be done either by ileum or colon. However, in children, the IC junction is not used. Colon is most commonly used because the ileocolic junction, if you remove it, then it might worsen the bowel complications and it might worsen the constipation. Also, ileum removal causes deficiency of vitamin B12. Use of colon also is got its own complications like mucus production and formation of stones. These bladder augmentation procedures are major surgeries with a 30-day all event rate of 30% and reoperation rate of 13%. Once a bowel is used to augment the bladder, there is always a lifelong risk of bladder perforation, which is around 6 to 13%. The continent cutaneous catheterizable channel complications can occur in 50 to 60%, either due to stenosis or due to incontinence. So, and another, if bowel is not to be used, then auto augmentation can be done, in which ureterocystoplasty or detrussorectomy with myotomy are the options. However, they are limited and cannot be applied to all the patients. For example, if you want to use or if you want to perform a ureterocystoplasty, then the ureter should be grossly dilated. Otherwise, an undilated ureter cannot be used to augment the bladder. Those patients who are not willing to perform CIC, the incontinent urinary diversion can be done with the help of use of bowel. And in those patients who have got sphincter underactivity, the outlet resistance can be augmented with the help of autologous facial or artificial slings. These techniques are better efficacious in females. 30% may develop low compliance. So once you increase the bladder outlet resistance, studies have found that the bladder may not cope with the increased volume to be stored. So this low compliance will in in future might require an additional augmentation procedure. Otherwise, there is risk of development of upper urinary tract changes. The vesico-ureteric reflux most commonly is secondary due to detrusor overactivity, and this can be managed at the same time of doing bladder augmentation. Endoscopic treatment has a failure rate of 75% at around median follow-up of 4.5 years. So if a patient is undergoing a primary bladder augmentation, then an open repair is preferred rather than an endoscopic treatment. Neuromodulation or nerve stimulation in children can be done by intravesical electrical stimulation of the bladder or sacral nerve stimulation or transcutaneous neuromodulation. However, in this age group, in the children, all these techniques are experimental. There is no sufficient data and cannot be recommended in children. If a child is very sick, suppose he is suffering from urosepsis, then a bladder augmentation procedure cannot be done at that time. So there are some temporary interventions which can be done, which include urethral dilatation, incontinent vesicostomy, sphincteric botulinum toxin injections. So as the name suggests, they are only temporary. Once the child recovers from febrile episode, once the urinary tract infection is settled, then a definitive treatment can be carried out at a later date. So in short, to give a summary, intervention for detrusor overactivity and sphincter underactivity. First, start with anticholinergics. CIC if there is significant PVR, and antibiotics if there is VUR. If patient is not managed with conservative management, then start with botulinum toxin injection. If clinical deterioration is noted or upper tract changes are seen, then proceed with augmentation of the bladder. If this fails, then a bladder neck closure and a urinary diversion is the last step. For detrusor overactivity and sphincter overactivity, again start with anticholinergics, a CIC if there is significant PVR, and antibiotics if there is VUR. Then it is followed by botulinum toxin. If it does not help, then augmentation. And again, if augmentation fails, the patient undergoes bladder neck closure procedures or urinary diversion. In the case of detrusor underactivity with sphincter overactivity, a CIC if there is significant PVR is to be done, and antibiotics if there is VUR. If it does not help, then bladder neck closure procedures or urinary diversion. In case of detrusor underactivity as well as sphincter underactivity, CIC if significant PVR, antibiotics if VUR, and bladder neck closure procedures or urinary diversion are the last steps. Follow-up obviously is lifelong, and it should include urologist, neurourologist, and orthopedics. Starting with the pathogenesis,